This meeting has been recorded so that anyone who misses this webinar can play it back at their own convenience. You'll be sent a link which you can access so that you can play back this when at a time that suits you. Good evening, Judith. I hope you managed to join it okay and you haven't had any technical issues. So I'm just going to start because we've got quite a lot of information to get through tonight in an hour. So I'm just going to make a start on the presentation just now. Feel free to put any comments you have in the chat box as we go along, and I'll try my best to answer any questions you've got as we're going. Okay, hi there, Judith. I think everybody's enjoying the warm weather today, Judith, and we think maybe they'll join as we go along. Okay, but anyway, we're going to carry on regardless. All right, so tonight's webinar is supporting learners with augmented and alternative communication forms. We're going to focus mainly on communication and interaction difficulties, but we'll spend quite a bit of time talking about what augmented and alternative communication actually is, for those of you who have not come across that term before. So this is, oh sorry, I've pressed the wrong button. Just get rid of that. So next. Oh, for some reason my PowerPoint is not moving. There we go. Sorry about that. So this is what our learning outcomes are for tonight. We're going to be looking at communicate with each of them. Communication difficulties. here. Obviously there's writing, and there's and using a computer. And then communication. So handshakes and gestures, etc. So here are some other ones that I've come up with, but there are many, many others. So speech, which is the most obvious one, sign language or Makaton, which is a modified sign language specifically for those with learning difficulties. Gesturing, body language, writing, reading, watching, listening, acting, miming, and emails. But as I said, there are many, many others, and you probably could have come up with a great big list. Oh, good evening, Helen. Everybody's gradually joining us. Okay, I'm just going to keep on going. But Helen, feel free to type anything into the chat room as we go. You can chat amongst each other in the chat room, and I can chat to you as well. All right, hopefully you can hear me nice and clearly. We did do a sound check and everything seemed to be fine. So I'm just going to carry on, okay? So augmented or assisted communication, what do we mean by those terms? Have you come across them before? Have you used them in your work? So this is what it actually means. So augmented or alternative communication, or AAC as it's often called, is a term used to describe various methods of communication that can add on to speech or help speech and get around problems that many people have with speech. It can include simple systems such as pictures and gestures or pointing, right down to very complex techniques involving computers. Like Stephen Hawking has, he has a computer that is his voice, doesn't he? Which is a form of augmented communication. So it's very simple, from a simple handshake, or those of you who work with very small children, you might find your child drags you to where it is they want you to go to. Instead, if they're unable to say it, they might drag you or lead you along to where they want. That's a form of augmented communication. So it's very simple or very complex, and somewhere in between as well often. So there are different types of augmented communication. Some kinds are part of everyday communication that we all do, like hand gestures, eye contact, waving, thumbs up, speaking, obviously pointing, and gesturing that we quite often do in a foreign country if we don't speak the language. We are using a form of augmented communication when we do this. But there are people who have to rely on this all the time, and it's these people that we want to focus on, particularly our learners that we may work with, or that we may work with at some point. So there is 3 different types of augmented communication. It's divided into three categories. So first of all, there's the no-tech or non-tech communication, which doesn't involve any additional equipment. So unaided. So examples of this are body language, gesturing, pointing, eye contact, facial expression, vocalising and signing, etc. So the very simplest forms that we can use to help someone understand what it is we're trying to communicate to them, or vice versa. And that's non-tech. And then the next method is low-tech. So again, doesn't need batteries or electronic equipment. So simple forms like pen and paper, using drawings or the alphabet or word boards, communication charts or books and pictures, photographs and symbols and particular objects or objects of reference. You may have come across those. Can be very, very useful, particularly when you're working with children and young people who have quite complex learning difficulties. Objects of reference is a very, very useful system to help communication. This is sometimes referred to as aided communication because you're using additional pieces of equipment to help the communication, but it's still not technology, is it? And then finally we have high-tech. So these are powered by battery or mains, so electronic in some way. Most of them speak or produce text, as I said earlier. Stephen Hawking has a computer that is his voice, doesn't he? There are very complex versions. I imagine his is top of the range, but there are lots and lots of methods of their computerized voices that can be used, and you may have come across some people that use a computer or a simplified computer to help them speak. I've worked with a young lad who had an iPad that he could use as his aid to communication, so he could type in keywords and he hit certain buttons and keywords would come up for him. It was a very basic type of augmented electronic computing, but not in any way like Stephen Hawking, obviously, but it did help him to be able to say, I want a drink, I want orange squash, and very simple basic human needs that he needed. It did allow him to be able to do that if he liked something, if he didn't like something. It wasn't very complex, it didn't have a huge vocabulary in it, this particular iPad, but it was set up to meet his specific needs and it worked nicely. So you may well have come across something like that, but then you can get very, very complex computer systems that have been designed specifically to meet the needs of that learner. As in the case, I'm going to refer to Stephen Hawking again, as his has been. He obviously has a very extensive vocabulary and he has a very extensive understanding of specific areas, particularly in science and physics. So his computer will be adapted to meet his communication needs. And this again is sometimes referred to as aided communication, but most of the time we would call this assisted communication or augmented communication. And most of the time when people think about augmented communication, it's this type of assistance that they're really thinking about. We forget about the very simple forms of assisted communication like gesturing and leading people to what it is we want them to do, and using our hands and our face, etc., to try and help communication. So who uses assisted communication? So a lot of people is the answer, basically. Some children, some adults who find speech difficult or who have unclear speech. Children and babies use it all the time, don't they? And as we said earlier, those of us who go on holiday abroad where we don't speak the language, we use it to try and communicate in another country. But more seriously, people who really rely on this are people who have maybe had an injury or have an illness or a disability, either learning or physical, such as cerebral palsy or a learning difficulty, things like motor neuron disease, which I think is what Stephen Hawking has, or have had a head injury or a stroke where it has affected their speech. Other ones with learning difficulties such as autism is a main one, where often speech has been not able to develop properly through a variety of different reasons, and often augmented communications are used with those who have learning difficulties. So why use it? Obviously, it's to help communication, isn't it? To help us all understand each other. Some people find it difficult to understand what someone else is saying. Maybe they've had a stroke, for instance, or if they've got a learning difficulty or a hearing impairment. Others might use other forms of assisted communication, something like drawing or writing or pointing at things in its very basic format to help people understand what they're saying. And we may well have come across relatives who have had a stroke, and for a time period as their body recovers, they may well do things like draw things or write things down to try and indicate what it is they want to say. But there are other people who will always use this type of communication because they cannot communicate in any other format, particularly those with complex learning difficulties. So it's recognising that there are a lot of people out there who use assisted communication, not just those of us who are using it for a foreign country, for instance, but the estimates are that there's 1 in 100 people who have significant communication difficulties and can be helped by the use of assisted or augmented communication to help better the communication, to help improve the quality of life and being part of society, which is what we want for everybody, don't we? So, some communication and interaction difficulties. So definition, this is what the actual definition of in a school or in a SEN code of practice. This is the definition of someone who would be identified as having a communication difficulty. So speech and language and communication difficulties are related to speech, obviously, grammar, an understanding of the meaning of words, which you might not have thought about as a communication difficulty, but it is. The use of language and comprehension. It is not having English as a second language, although some people may have, for a short period of time, until they have developed enough English, a communication difficulty, as we would have in another country. This is not a SEND need, is it? This will be identified and this will be rectified by EAL, by English as a Foreign Language Support. But that doesn't mean that those who have English as a second language don't also have communication difficulties. That can also be the case. In fact, I worked with a young girl a couple of years ago who was Portuguese, and she arrived at my school and she didn't have any English, and her IEP came with her that had been translated, which was never a good idea, but there you go. And on the IEP it said that she didn't speak and that she had no vocabulary whatsoever. She made the occasional sound but no actual forming of words in Portuguese. And we took this IEP at its word. One day there was a support worker walked in from another classroom and she spoke Spanish, and she started chatting to this girl just because she noticed that she was kind of Spanish or Portuguese, and the girl responded to her in Portuguese. So it turned out that this girl, although she was autistic and had complex learning difficulties, she actually did have speech. She just didn't speak English. But that was really good because it meant then we could start developing with her and working on strategies to help support her speech, and we put in place a one-to-one for her. But you know, the IEP had come with us telling us, it had translated that she had no spoken language, and if we hadn't chanced upon this woman coming in and speaking Spanish to her, I might have gone through the full year without this poor girl ever saying a word. And it was just, it always sticks with me, the importance of overcoming these types of barriers and not always accepting on face value, yeah, I know exactly what an IEP might tell you, especially when that person has moved from another part of the country, or in this case another country altogether. So communication and interaction difficulties, this is some of the cases that will cause a communication interaction difficulty. So hearing impairment, obviously, a visual impairment, because communication isn't just about speech, as we know, it's a whole section of things that are linked together to make communication a whole, what's the word? You know, it's not just about one sense, is it? It's all our senses are involved in communication. We use our body, we use our eyes, we use our movement, we use all sorts of things just when we're speaking. So visual impairment can have a huge impact. ADHD, you probably come across if you work in schools, young people with ADHD and autism, as we mentioned earlier, those on the spectrum definitely have communication difficulties to some degree or another. If they're high on the spectrum, if they're high functioning, they may well have very good verbal communication skills, but what they will lack is the social skills along with those communications. So they may well be able to communicate using a lot of words and have quite a complex vocabulary, but they might not necessarily be able to use it in the correct way or understanding of it. And then you have those who have much more complex needs on the spectrum who may have no verbal communication whatsoever. Global learning difficulties or mild learning difficulties can have lots of communication difficulties where there's an impairment in the brain that is stopping communication developing properly, the ability to communicate effectively, whether it be speech or eye contact or there is brain damage there that's causing this. Asperger's, which is the part of the autistic spectrum, global developmental delay, which can be very specific. It can just attach itself to a specific area of developmental delay. So, for instance, it could be communication. Dyslexia. Dyslexia not only involves written work, as we know, and reading, but it also can involve speech. And some people have an inability to be able to sound out words correctly. I've come across adults who have, over the years, developed strategies of coping with dyslexia, speech dyslexia, where they just slur all their words together, and you may well have come across people like this as well. But it is a communication difficulty. Emotional and social and behavioural issues can also cause communication difficulties. A cleft palate, again, it's a physical disability, or can be a physical disability, often fixed very, very successfully nowadays by surgeons, but still it can cause communication delay, because the child, when they're in their formative years learning how to speak properly, if they're in the process of going through operations to correct their cleft palate, will often have speech impediments, and their communication may well be a little bit back from where it should be for their age. Glue ear is linked to hearing impairment, isn't it? Although it's often a temporary condition that can be fixed, but it can cause communication difficulties. So, support for those that need help. So this is what they need. So they need help to acquire and comprehend and use language appropriately. Articulation, as we mentioned with the dyslexia, sometimes that can be a real problem. Using alternative or augmented means of communication to help develop communication, and not just with those with complex needs, but augmented communication, as we said, it can be very, very simple, like hand gestures and body language, etc., right down to very complex needs. Using a variety of different different methods of communication to help communication be understood by all. Acquiring literacy skills to help all people who come through our schools and colleges acquire literacy skills is a real key to life, isn't it? Organising and coordinating oral and written language appropriately, being able to use grammar in the correct way, etc. So, the key elements of communication, when it's broken down, this is how it's broken down into 3 key elements of communication. Now, Kerry, I think you've heard me say this before. Good evening, Kerry. But I'm going to say it again because I think it's worth going over it again in the context of augmented communication. So, first of all, we have the form or the grammar, the correct use of words, and understanding of how words should be placed within a context. And then the content or the vocabulary, the amount of words and the types of words that we use in a sentence or in a speech, etc., etc., in written or verbal communication. And then how we use it, knowing how to use our language properly and appropriately. For instance, understanding the rules of conversation, such as taking turns. This can be a huge issue with those on the autistic spectrum, because they tend to be very introverted, don't they? They don't tend to see the need to engage in conversation with others. It's the nature of the condition, isn't it? Autism means self, and it tends to be about themselves, so they wouldn't see the need to say, for instance, how are you today? But it is part of being able to communicate effectively. So, it's doing fancy things. My PowerPoint, I didn't know it could do this, and it still surprises me when things fly in. Anyway, so they have a pattern, okay? And it's always hierarchical when we learn anything just about, and especially with those who have a learning difficulty or children, we have to be secure with one piece of information and understanding before we can move on to the next. So like building blocks, we have to have the one at the base secure, then we can put the next one on top of it. And with our development of communication, this is the same, exactly the same, and especially with those with learning difficulties and children, this is how they learn. Has to be secure in one area, then we can move on to the next. We can't just dip in and out. We have to be theoretical and clear and structured and hierarchical in our methods. And then these work together, hopefully, to have successful communication. And are moved through the different ways by each individual. So all individuals will be able to progress at different rates, depending on their abilities. So this is how to break it down. So this is a kind of suggestion of how we might help communication. So it's an example of receptive communication. So for instance, you have a pupil and you're taking them to do some intervention work with them to develop their communication skills. So first of all, it's got to be for very, very short stretches of time, 10, 15 minutes maximum, no longer, because you've lost them. And once you've lost them, then you'll have behaviour, etc. And there's no point. They're not going to learn anything. So very short stretches of time. Then the next thing is to focus on key words, the key words that are needed in the communication. So it might be that you're using a mixture of signs and symbols or gestures, etc., depending on the needs of that individual. So you could be using a mixture of augmented communication with verbal communication, or you could completely use augmented communication depending on the needs of that young person or adult for that matter. So, but the key is to keep it to 4 words so that you do not confuse that person. But you need to make sure that the words you choose are clear and that they indicate what it is that you want that person to do or you are going to do with that person. So for example, you've got a young lad and you're reading a book about dinosaurs and it's in the library. So instead of saying, oh, we're going to get the big book about dinosaurs from the library, why don't we go in and you launch into a kind of flowery sentence about how wonderful the book about dinosaurs is. You cut all that out and you just simply say, get big book dinosaurs, and you may point to where the dinosaur book is and you take out all the extra language. So you've got the key word, which is he has to get it. So you've got the command, and then you're telling him what it is he's to get. It's the big book and it's dinosaurs. And these are the key words. And whatever it is we're trying to communicate with our people, our young people or our adults for that matter, we remember to keep it to key words and get rid of all the extra little words that are not necessary or the flowery language that we generally use. It's interesting that in sign language there is no word for the, because it's just not necessary. So when we're using the, we may well wish to drop words like that, the and what little words like that that are joining words that we don't need, that we can do without, and that will only cause confusion. It may well be that we're reading the book, this could be a different book, so we're discussing an event or we're discussing a story or an experience with a young person to try and develop conversation skills. Again, we're keeping it down to these 4 key words. So for instance, where has boy gone? We're taking out the. So we're not launching into a big long explanation about where the boy possibly could have gone and, oh, he's over there, or could he be over there? Oh no, he's around there. We're keeping it very simple. And you may well assist this with images, particularly visual images can be very, very useful. Again, using forms of augmented communication to help enhance and help develop the understanding of what it is we are communicating with that child or that young person. And I've got a little arrow that comes up. There we go. So breaking it down. Successful communication is broken down into these 3 sections. So the form, remembering keeping it to a maximum of 4 key words and making sure that these are words that the content clear. using forms of augmented communication where appropriate to aid and develop and help the understanding with the person, the child. But make sure that the vocabulary is understood by them. There's no point in introducing new words before they understand other words, and getting rid of all small words that are not necessary, all joining words, etc. And flowery language. And then use, practicing listening, practicing taking turns, practicing the art of conversations, using short stories, but remembering everything always for a short period of time, no longer than 10 or 15 minutes for your intervention times, because it's just too much. It's very difficult for the person to concentrate for any length of time. I think a good analogy of it is if you are learning a foreign language, if anyone's ever tried to do this, if you're trying to learn a foreign language, and even if you're really, really up for it and you're desperate to learn French, for instance, after about 20 minutes or so, it's too much. It's all the vocabulary is new, and your brain just starts to get into a muddle, and you have to have a rest. If you think that it does have an injury to it, or it has happening as fast as it does happen in the normal brain. Sorry, that's not a good terminology to use, but it explains best what I'm trying to say. And a little star. So clarity. Don't get lost in translation. And this is very easily done. Again, it's making sure that we don't use too much words, too many flowery words that we use all the time in language and we don't even realise we're doing it. So making sure that we are very aware of this and cutting it all out. So keeping our terminology simple, logical and direct. And check the understanding. So ask questions, double check and ask for examples where appropriate as well, to make sure that your young person is understood. And a good way to do this is to use visual images to help check understanding. If they hand you the correct visual image, that they have understood what the question was. So for instance, you might have different images and you want them to pick out the correct one, then you handing you the correct, obviously that's the correct answer. It's a way of checking, isn't it? But it will depend on the needs of the child or the young person you're working with. A lack of clarity obviously will cause confusion, unnecessary stress. And as we said, particularly with those whose brain is already struggling to cope with the amount of learning that it's taken on, it's much harder for those who have a learning difficulty to learn than it is obviously for those who don't have. And it is tiring. If you watch some of your young people who have got a learning difficulty or a physical illness, I've just seen Judith has mentioned cerebral palsy, you can see by the end of the day, at the end of the school day, they are shattered. So we don't want to cause unnecessary stress. This will cause unnecessary errors, and also make sure we try not and how we speak and how we ensure that we are clear. All this time clarifying again and again. If we just make sure we're clear from the start, we will save a lot of time in the long run, which is obvious, isn't it? So think about this. Where's my picture gone? Here he is. So imagine you're speaking to someone who has a hearing impairment and you're trying to explain to them where Norfolk is in relation to the rest of the United Kingdom. What methods of communication would be successful and what methods wouldn't? So would you like to type something in the box? Now, I don't know where Judith and Helen are from. Are you from Norfolk or are you from further afield? I know Kerry is from Norfolk. Yep, you're Norfolk. Bournemouth, oh, further afield. So imagine you're trying to explain to someone who has a hearing impairment where Bournemouth is. What methods would you use? Would you try and shout at them and say and point, it's down the south coast? What might you do? Yeah, visual aids, that's the way to go, isn't it? Maps, etc. And maybe putting where in relation from where he is to where he wants to be, etc. It's got to be visual, isn't it? It just makes sense that you would use visual aids. So that the person has, and try and adapt methods of communication someone who has impairment, then you're going to be visual. If you have someone who is autistic, then you're if you have someone who is got a visual impairment, you're so it's things of methods of augmented of each individual learner. Good one. It's very pointing I like. I think pointing. So overcoming the communication barriers. Identify type of communication difficulty. Now this might take some doing, especially if we're just about to finish for the summer, and then some of us might be going back in September to a new group of learners that we're going to be working with. So we're starting from scratch, aren't we? And we've got to work out exactly what is the communication difficulty. What is it they don't understand? Because it could be that actually their speech is quite clear, but it could be more complex than that, couldn't it? I've worked with a number of autistic people over the years who can read and write accurately, very accurately, but they don't understand what they're reading and they don't understand what they're writing. So they're not communicating effectively, are they? They're not comprehending what they're reading or what they're writing. They cannot explain to me what it is they are writing and reading. But they have the physical dexterity to be able to hold a pen correctly and form the letter shapes and remember how to do that. And they have the ability to remember word shapes and read correctly and pronounce them correctly, but they're not communicating effectively. Exactly, it's mechanics, it's not comprehension. So we have to look at these people, look at the children, look at the young people we're working with carefully, observe them and identify clearly and exactly where the difficulty lies. In some cases it's going to be very obvious, in other cases it's going to be much more complex. So this is where our ILPs are and our notes that we take on the young people and our observations as we build up a picture of how we're going to support them begins usually at the start of the year or when that person joins us really. And then identify methods that we can use to assist them. What do we have at our disposal? What does the thinking outside of the box, thinking if something has been tried and tested with a group of young people or a group of children, it might well be that it has all of the time. But remember be afraid to try things. Work. It'll never work. It's worth trying. I remember being told years ago that Karen, you'll just break it. There's no point in trying. But I said, just let me try. Let me try. And eventually he held a paintbrush. So think keep trying, don't give up, be determined that you are going to be positive and offer positive support. Think about the children and the young people. Think about the importance of them being able to communicate effectively and what it will do for their lives if we can help them communicate better. So some learning difficulties. This is the key area really that we're going to be working with usually in schools. Learning difficulties or complex difficulties where you might have cerebral palsy or a physical illness combined with a learning difficulty. So there's specific difficulties, isn't there? And there's influences and there's other issues around this. It's never simple when you're dealing with learning difficulties. There's all sorts of things going on there. So we have to consider this, and this is why creating this good picture of the person and treating them as an individual is the key. Think about when we're talking about augmented communication methods. It could be that we could get or the college that we could use with this. There's lots and lots of education. If we languages and the programs that are available to help us learn foreign languages, it's education. There are programs out there specifically for SEND that can so you can get and try different things. For some children an iPad will be great, but for others it might not be. It might be just too complicated for them and they won't be able to use it properly, and it might hinder them. So you might want to use simpler things like physical images, photographs, or laminated pictures. Some of you might have used Widget in the past, which is a computer program that translates symbols into words into symbols rather, that can be very, very useful. that children can use as well, and it can be used to make resources. Remember the previous information. Girl from earlier on who I spoke about who was Portuguese. The previous information I had which is why I suggest that you really do and observe yourself at what's going on, but take into consideration make sure if you know or staff that have worked with the person, the parents, talk to them. Where they've got to with that young person, so that you know where you're going to go to help set targets. Be clear. Avoid jargon. In education, we have lots and lots of jargon, don't we? In SEN, we have even more. But there you go. So avoid it. It just causes confusion. And to be honest, it causes confusion for us all. When we move from school to school, all schools, if those of you who have worked in more than one, you'll know that we all have our own jargon, don't we? So try avoid jargon, and especially avoid jargon around our young people who have a communication difficulty. Write for them, not about them. So by this I mean, especially if you're writing homeschool diaries or you're involved in writing ILPs, more and more now we're trying to focus, particularly with ILPs and any for them. So even if that person can't read it, writing about them as if they could, and that we speak about them in a way that we would want to be spoken about. So, for example, at this moment, read their ILP. If you state it in such a way as we are working with to help her read and then you might add in some comments from Gemma about her progress, making it person-centered. Don't write in jargon. Don't write in teacher speak, but make it plain English and plain language that you would be happy for that person to read, even if they can't read it, and you would be happy for their parents to read it as well. And that helps keep things simple and clear, and it's about them, not, and it's for them. It's not, it's not like a medical records, which only a doctor has to understand. And ensure it can be clearly understood, obviously. Make sure our targets, any set targets we set, make sure they're smart, specific, measurable, achievable, realistic and timed. So don't set unreachable targets, you're setting them up for failure, obviously. Be inclusive, which is what we're all about in SEND, aren't we, is inclusive. So making sure that our young person isn't excluded from the rest of the class. At times they will be, at times you to be out with the classroom. But as in the whole body of the class, they've been sent to a mainstream as much as possible. So try and include them. If it's a special school, again, the whole idea of a special school is that it is inclusive and that everybody works together. Now this is quite an interesting thing to look at, is our own communication. There's a bit of a focus on this at the moment from Ofsted, so I'm going to talk about that in a little while. But remembering how we speak and the clarity of our own speech so that we avoid confusing those that we're trying to help, particularly. And it's very easily done. So some questions that we should maybe consider ourselves. Are we talking too often? Again, I mentioned earlier on about the flowery language and the use of too much language being overpowering and how we have to reduce it right down to key words. So thinking about how much are we talking? How much are we talking at that child, with that child, around that child? Is it at an appropriate volume? Are we speaking too quietly? Are they struggling to hear us? Are we speaking too loudly? Are we giving them a headache? Do we leave enough time for them to contribute? So don't be afraid of the silence. Remember, it's taken their brain much longer to cognise the words together into sense that we have just spoken to them. So if it seems that there's a long silence between you stating something to them